The woman behind the counter didn't even let him finish pulling out his wallet. She looked him over, once the worn jacket, the scuffed shoes, the quiet way he stood, and her expression settled into something close to contempt. Lauren Mitchell had managed Willow Terrace for 6 years, and she believed she could read a person in under 10 seconds. She believed she was never wrong. So when the man in front of her asked about his change, she smiled, swept the coins off the counter, and let them hit the floor. Then she looked him in the eye and said,
"Get down and pick it up."
"Get down and pick it up." Ryan Carter had a rule about first visits. He never announced them, never sent an advance team, never gave anyone a reason to prepare. He walked in the way any ordinary person would. No reservation, no introduction, nothing to suggest he was anything other than a man who wanted a cup of coffee and somewhere quiet to sit. It was the only way to see a place as it actually was, not as it performed when it knew it was being watched. He had learned that lesson early, and it had saved him from making expensive mistakes more than once. He had closed the acquisition of the Willow Terrace chain 11 days earlier, 7 locations across 3 states purchased for a sum that would have made most people stop breathing for a moment if they heard it spoken out loud. The paperwork was done, the transfer was complete, and the previous ownership had cleared out without much ceremony. What remained now was the slower, less dramatic work of actually understanding what he had bought. Not the financials, he knew those already. What he needed to understand was the culture, the way people moved through a place, the way staff spoke to each other when no one important was watching, the way a room felt at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday when the lunch rush hadn't arrived and the night before had already been forgotten. That was why he chose Willow Terrace first. It was the flagship location, the one the previous owners had always used in their marketing materials and press releases. If the culture was going to be strong anywhere, it should have been here. And if it wasn't strong here, it wasn't going to be strong anywhere. Ryan dressed the same way he always did for these visits. Dark jeans, a plain gray shirt, a jacket that had been good quality once, but now wore its age in small, visible ways. Scuffed shoes he had never gotten around to replacing. He looked like a man who worked with his hands, or maybe one who used to, and hadn't quite adjusted to not doing it anymore. He looked, in short, like someone who didn't belong in a restaurant with pressed white tablecloths and a wine list printed on heavy cardstock. That was the point. That was always the point. He pushed through the front door at 10:47 in the morning and stood for a moment just inside the entrance, letting his eyes adjust. The dining room was about a third full. Soft lighting, dark wood paneling tables, arranged with enough space between them to suggest that privacy was considered a service worth providing. It was a handsome room. He had known that from the photographs. What the photographs hadn't told him was whether the room felt welcoming or merely expensive, and he was still forming that opinion when he heard a voice from the host stand. "Can I help you?" The tone made it a formality rather than a question. Lauren Mitchell was standing behind the stand with a tablet in her hand and an expression that communicated with efficient clarity that she had already assessed him and found the result unimpressive. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back and the kind of practiced composure that came from years of managing rooms and the people in them. She wore her authority the way some people wore expensive clothes, visibly deliberately making sure it registered. Ryan offered a straightforward answer, telling her he'd just like a coffee and something small to eat, maybe a croissant if they had one. He wasn't looking for a full table. A seat at the bar was fine. Lauren's gaze moved over him once more, the way someone might check a box they already knew the answer to. She told him the bar was full, it was not, and that he could wait if he wanted a table. But the wait would be at least 20 minutes. She returned her attention to the tablet as though the matter were settled. Ryan looked past her toward the bar, which had 2 empty stools and a third with a jacket draped over it. He counted 4 unoccupied tables in the dining room without trying very hard. He said nothing about any of it. He said that waiting was fine and took a seat on the bench near the entrance. From that position, he had a clear view of most of the room. He watched. He had always been good at watching. It was the skill his business school professors hadn't taught him, and the one that had served him better than almost anything else. What he saw over the next 12 minutes was not encouraging. A table near the window had been waiting for their check long enough that the woman seated there had started looking around, with the specific expression people wore when they had already decided to say something, but were still hoping they wouldn't have to. A water glass at another table had been empty for longer than it should have been. A young waitress, her name tag read. Emily was moving through the room with visible efficiency, covering more ground than her section should have required, picking up the slack of something or someone that Ryan couldn't immediately identify. Lauren, for her part, was doing very little that resembled hospitality management. She moved through the space with the demeanor of someone inspecting a property they didn't much like, spoke to two of the staff in tones too low to carry across the room, but with body language that communicated disapproval without ambiguity, and twice paused near tables of well-dressed guests to offer the kind of warm, solicitous attention that had been entirely absent when Ryan walked through the door. He noticed that too. He filed it away without expression. After 14 minutes, Lauren appeared in front of him and told him with the air of someone granting a concession that a table had opened up. She walked him to a two-top near the back of the room, which was not technically in a bad location, but was the furthest possible point from the tables she had been tending with such visible enthusiasm. Ryan sat down, picked up the menu, and ordered a black coffee and a croissant when Emily appeared at his table, slightly breathless, apologizing for the wait. He told her there was no need to apologize. She looked at him for half a second longer than necessary, as though the response had surprised her, then nodded and moved back toward the kitchen. The coffee arrived in reasonable time. It was good coffee, better than he'd expected, actually, which was a point in someone's favor. The croissant was warm and had been made properly, the layers visible and distinct, the exterior with the right amount of resistance before giving way. Whatever the kitchen was doing, they were doing it correctly. Ryan drank his coffee slowly and let the room continue to show him what it was. The bill, when it came, arrived on a small black tray. He put down enough cash to cover the total with a reasonable tip, and Emily collected it and carried it back toward the register. 2 minutes later, Lauren returned with the tray instead of Emily. She set it down on the table without ceremony and turned to leave. Ryan looked at the tray. The change was wrong, not slightly wrong, short by $4, and some additional coins that should have been there. He said calmly that he thought there might be a mistake with his change. Lauren turned back toward him with an expression that managed to combine impatience and condescension into something almost architectural. She said she was fairly certain the amount was correct, and that perhaps he'd like to look at the bill again. Her tone suggested that she was explaining something to someone who had difficulty with basic arithmetic. Ryan said he had looked at the bill. He said the total was clear, and that the amount returned to him did not match what should have been left after the payment he'd made. He kept his voice level and his posture easy, which seemed for reasons he couldn't immediately explain to irritate Lauren more than an argument would have. She picked up the bill from the tray and looked at it. The look lasted longer than it would have if she had simply been checking a number. Then she put it back down and said that the register had been accurate to her knowledge, and that if he felt there was a discrepancy, he was welcome to take it up with the front desk. She said it the way people said things they didn't expect to be acted upon. Ryan said he would appreciate that if she didn't mind. Something shifted in Lauren's expression then. It was a small shift, barely visible, a tightening at the corners of her mouth, a slight elevation of her chin. But Ryan had spent enough years reading rooms and the people in them to recognize what it meant. It meant she had decided to stop performing patience and start performing authority instead. She told him loud enough now that the nearest tables could hear that she found it interesting he was so concerned about a few dollars. Given that, and here she allowed a brief but pointed survey of his jacket, his shoes, his general presentation. He appeared to have other financial priorities. There was laughter, brief and uncomfortable from somewhere to Ryan's left. At another table, someone looked down at their plate. Ryan did not respond to that. He looked at her steadily, said nothing, and waited. Lauren took that silence as confirmation of what she had already decided about him. She picked up the tray, removed the bills he had set down, and held them up, as though examining them for authenticity. She announced, not quietly, that the restaurant had a policy about accepting certain forms of payment, and that she would need to verify the currency before she could process the transaction. It was not a real policy, Ryan knew that, because it was his restaurant, and he had read every operational document produced under the previous ownership in the weeks before the sale closed. But Lauren said it with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged on anything they had invented, and the room responded to that confidence the way rooms usually did, with silence, with avoidance, with a collective decision to look elsewhere and let whatever was happening finish happening. Emily appeared briefly in Ryan's peripheral vision, carrying a tray toward a table across the room. She glanced in his direction. Her expression lasted less than 2 seconds before she looked away. But Ryan caught it, the slight tightening of her jaw, the downward flicker of her eyes. She had seen this before. She knew exactly what was happening, and she also knew with the particular clarity of someone who had bills to pay and a job she could not afford to lose, that there was nothing she could do about it. Ryan understood. He had no anger toward her for that. He had been in rooms where the cost of speaking was higher than most people were willing to pay, and he had made his own calculations in those rooms in his younger years. He did not judge Emily for hers. Lauren returned the bills to the tray after a theatrical examination and announced that the currency appeared to be acceptable. She said this as though she had performed a service. The change she put down was still short. Ryan looked at it. He looked at Lauren. She met his gaze without flinching, which told him everything he needed to know about how many times she had stood in exactly this position, with exactly this kind of certainty, and walked away without consequence. He had 2 options. He could stand up, put the insufficient change in his pocket, and leave. Many people had done that before him. He was already certain of it. There was a whole history of small humiliations at this table, at this restaurant, that had ended exactly that way, with a person deciding that their dignity was worth less than the energy it would take to fight for it. Or he could stay. He could let this continue until it had finished arriving at wherever it was going. He could see in full the shape of the problem he had purchased, along with the liquor license and the kitchen equipment and the brand name. Ryan settled back in his chair. He picked up the last half of his coffee and drank it. He was not leaving. Not yet. There was still something here worth seeing. Lauren did not walk away after the change dispute. That was the first sign that the situation had moved into different territory. A manager who had simply been careless with someone's money would have corrected the error or walked away from the argument. Lauren did neither. She stood at the edge of Ryan's table with the tray still in her hand, and the particular stillness of someone who had decided at some point in the last 2 minutes that this had become about something other than $4. She told Ryan in a tone that carried just far enough to reach the surrounding tables that she noticed he had been sitting for quite a while over a single coffee and a croissant. She said the restaurant had an informal understanding that tables were intended for guests who were dining, and that if he had finished, she would be happy to help him find his way out. She said it with a smile that had no warmth anywhere in it. Ryan looked at her and said simply that he wasn't finished yet. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down without any change in his expression. Lauren's smile stayed in place. She asked if he would be ordering anything else. He said probably not. She said then she was sure he understood. He said he understood perfectly, and still did not move. The smile finally left her face. She set the tray down on an adjacent empty table with slightly more force than the situation required, and walked back toward the host stand, where she stood for a moment, with her back to the room, before turning to survey it again. At the table near the window, Emily was refilling water glasses. She moved efficiently, as she always did, making herself useful across a wider range of the floor than her assigned section technically covered. As she passed Ryan's table, she asked quietly, without making eye contact, whether he would like a refill on the coffee. He said he would. She poured it, and left without another word, but the gesture was not nothing. Ryan noted it the same way he noted everything else, without expression, without acknowledgement, but with complete attention. The room had settled back into its rhythms after the exchange over the change. Conversations had resumed. The discomfort that had briefly surfaced across the nearby tables had been smoothed back over by time, and the general human preference for pretending that small cruelties are not happening when witnessing them requires inconvenient action. Ryan understood that too. He had no contempt for it. It was simply what rooms did. What happened next did not come from Lauren immediately. It came first from the security guard, a heavy-set man in his mid-40s, whose name tag read Douglas, who appeared at the edge of Ryan's section and took up a position near the wall about 8 feet from his table. He was not subtle about it. He stood with his arms crossed and his attention directed at Ryan with the focused, slightly performative vigilance of someone who had been told to watch a specific person and didn't mind if that person knew it. Ryan glanced at him once, registered the situation, and returned his attention to his coffee. Lauren reappeared 3 minutes later. She came from the direction of the host stand and stopped beside Ryan's table again this time, with her hands clasped in front of her rather than holding the tray. The posture was different, less casual, more deliberate, as though she had used the intervening time to compose a next move. She told Ryan that she needed to be direct with him. She said that several guests had expressed discomfort, that his presence was creating a disruption, and that she was going to have to ask him to leave the premises. Ryan asked which guests had expressed discomfort. Lauren said she wasn't at liberty to discuss that. He said he understood, and asked if she could point him to the policy that allowed the restaurant to remove a paying customer who had not behaved disruptively. Lauren said that management retained the right to refuse service to anyone. Ryan said he was aware of that, and that he was asking specifically about the basis for her current request. Something moved across Lauren's face, not quite uncertainty, but something adjacent to it, like a person who has rehearsed a conversation and encountered an unexpected response in the second line. She recovered quickly. She said that his behavior, and here, she allowed a specific emphasis on the word, as though the word itself were evidence, had been suspicious since he arrived, and that the restaurant had a responsibility to its other guests to maintain a safe and comfortable environment. Ryan asked what specific behavior she was referring to. Lauren said that his reluctance to leave when asked was itself demonstrating her point. From across the room, Emily had gone very still. She was standing beside a service station with a stack of folded napkins in her hands, and she had stopped folding them. She was watching the exchange with the expression of someone who recognized a pattern they had seen before and had spent considerable energy trying not to think about between shifts. She looked once toward the host stand, then down at the napkins, and began folding again. She had learned over months of working under Lauren that the cost of visible reaction was almost always redirected back onto the person who showed it. Lauren told Ryan that she was going to need to ask him to open his bag for inspection before he left. She said it as though this were a reasonable standard request, the kind of thing that was simply done here in this restaurant as a matter of course. Ryan looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached down, picked up the canvas bag he had brought with him, and opened it. It contained a phone, a folded document that Lauren showed no interest in examining closely once it was visible, a set of keys, and a paperback book with a broken spine. Lauren looked at the contents. There was nothing in them that could have justified what she had started, and they both knew it. Ryan held the bag open a few seconds longer than necessary, making sure the point was fully visible to anyone at the surrounding tables who cared to look. Then he zipped it closed and set it back down. Lauren did not apologize. She did not acknowledge that the inspection had produced nothing. She simply pivoted with the smooth, uninterrupted confidence of someone to whom accountability had never been introduced, and told Ryan that regardless of the contents of his bag, her earlier request stood. She wanted him to leave. She said that if he refused, she would contact the police and report that he was trespassing on private property. Ryan said that he understood her position. He said he would be leaving shortly. He said it in the same even tone he had been using for the entirety of the conversation, and Lauren stared at him for a moment, as though trying to locate the anger she expected, and finding the wrong thing in its place. She reached into her jacket pocket then. What she removed was the change from the bill, the correct amount this time, or close enough to it, and she set it on the table. She set it down with too much force, and the coins scattered. Several rolled off the edge of the table. 2 or 3 hit the floor. The paper bills drifted. Lauren looked at the mess she had made, and then looked at Ryan, and what crossed her face in that moment was not embarrassment and not hesitation. It was decision, deliberate and clear. She looked at him the way people look at someone they have decided completely, and without qualification does not deserve the same consideration they would extend to anyone else in the room. "Get down and pick it up," Lauren said. She said it quietly, which somehow made it worse. A loud command can be dismissed as temper. This was something else, measured, specific, delivered with the full weight of someone who believed they were well within their rights and expected to be obeyed. The dining room went silent in the particular way that rooms go silent when something has happened that everyone present recognizes as wrong and no one moves to address. The couple at the nearest table looked at each other. A man 2 tables back set down his fork. Emily across the room stopped moving entirely. Ryan did not move. He looked at the coins on the floor and the bills on the table, and then he looked at Lauren Mitchell, and what she saw in his face was the same thing she had been seeing for the entire duration of the conversation. Nothing she could use, nothing she could dismiss, nothing that looked like what she expected. He was not humiliated. He was not angry. He was watching her with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who was collecting information and had no particular urgency about finishing. Lauren took that stillness as defiance. She straightened slightly and said again that the money was on the floor and that if he wanted it, he knew what to do. Douglas, still positioned near the wall, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, but said nothing and did not move toward the table. Whatever authority he had been lent for this situation, he had not been given instructions that covered what was currently happening, and he was not a man who acted beyond his instructions. A few guests had taken out their phones, not obviously not raised above the table, but the small, angled movements of people who had made a quiet decision to document what they were witnessing. Ryan noticed that too. He noted the table positions, the angles, the number of people who had made that particular choice. He filed it away the same way he had been filing everything away since he walked through the door at 10:47. Ryan reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He did not pick up the coins. He did not argue. He looked at the screen, found a contact, and made a call that lasted less than 40 seconds. He said very little on the call, just a name, a location, and a brief instruction to come when it was convenient. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and looked up at Lauren, who was still standing at the edge of his table with the absolute certainty of someone who had never once stood in a room and discovered that the room did not belong to her. "I'll wait," Ryan said. Lauren's expression shifted for the first time in a way she could not immediately control. It was small, a fraction of a second, where something that might have been uncertainty moved through her face before she closed it off. She told him that he could wait outside, that she was not going to allow him to continue occupying a table in her dining room, and that she would be calling the police in 10 minutes if he had not vacated the premises. Ryan said that 10 minutes was more than enough. He looked down at the coins on the floor, the ones Lauren had scattered with deliberate force, the ones she had told him to get down and retrieve, and he picked them up. Not because she had told him to. Not with any visible resentment or performance of compliance. He picked them up the way a person picks up something that belongs to them, steadily and completely, because leaving money on the floor of a room you intended to rebuild served no one. He placed the coins on the table next to the bills, folded. His hands leaned back slightly in his chair and waited. The room did not fully return to its previous rhythms after that. People were eating or going through the motions of eating, but the texture of the air in the room had changed. Conversations were quieter. People were paying attention with their peripheral vision in the way that people do when they are not sure what they are waiting for, but are fairly confident something is still coming. Emily had resumed her rounds, but she moved through the room with the careful deliberateness of someone who was watching without appearing to watch. She refilled a glass she had already refilled, straightened a napkin that was already straight. Lauren had retreated to the host stand, where she made 2 phone calls of her own and spoke in low, rapid tones to Douglas, who listened and nodded and repositioned himself closer to the front entrance. She was not looking at Ryan. The not looking was its own form of attention, more deliberate than watching, more conscious of the thing it was avoiding. Douglas stood near the door with his arms still crossed, his expression neutral in the way that people go neutral when they are no longer certain which side of a situation they are standing on. 8 minutes passed. Ryan sat with his hands on the table and the coins stacked in a neat column in front of him. He did not look at his phone. He did not look around the room. He looked at the middle distance with the patience of someone who had no doubt about what was coming and no anxiety about how long it would take to arrive. The front door of Willow Terrace opened at 11:22 in the morning. The sound of it was unremarkable, just a door opening, the ordinary sound of the outside world, briefly entering a controlled interior space. But Lauren looked up from the host stand with the expression of someone who had been waiting for the police and received instead something she had not prepared for. Ava Reynolds walked in like she had been called, which she had wearing a gray blazer, moving with the kind of directness that took up space without announcing itself. She was the regional director across all 7 locations that had changed hands 11 days earlier. She knew every property, every staff roster, and every outstanding performance issue in the chain. She also knew Ryan Carter well enough to recognize the specific quality of stillness he carried when something had gone significantly wrong, and he had decided to let it finish arriving before he addressed it. Ava did not stop at the host stand. She did not speak to Lauren, who was already straightening with the automatic deference she showed to anyone who looked like they might have authority over her. Ava walked directly across the dining room to the table near the back where Ryan was sitting, and she addressed him by name, Mr. Carter, in a tone that was professional and entirely normal, and carried in the context of where they were and what had just happened, the force of a building falling. Lauren Mitchell heard it from across the room. She heard the name. She looked at the man in the worn jacket and the scuffed shoes sitting at the table she had just ordered to get down on the floor, and she understood in the specific physical way that understanding sometimes arrives less like a thought than like a change in temperature, exactly what she had done, and exactly who she had done it to. The dining room was very quiet. No one was pretending to look elsewhere anymore. Ava pulled out the chair across from Ryan and sat down without being invited, which was the kind of familiarity that only made sense if you already knew the room belonged to the person you were sitting with. She set her phone face down on the table, looked at Ryan, and asked him quietly if he was all right. He said he was fine. She looked at the stack of coins he had placed on the table and said nothing about them, but her jaw tightened slightly before she returned her attention to his face. Lauren had not moved from the host stand. She was standing with one hand resting on the edge of the counter and the expression of someone who was running rapid calculations and finding that none of the numbers were coming out in her favor. Douglas had taken 2 steps toward the entrance and then stopped. He looked at Ava, then at Ryan, then at Lauren, and made the quiet individual decision to step back against the wall and wait to be told what to do next. Whatever instructions he had been operating under for the past hour, he understood without being told that they no longer applied. The couple at the nearest table had given up any pretense of their own conversation and were watching the 2 people at the back table with undisguised attention. A man sitting alone near the window had his phone resting at an angle on the table that suggested he had not stopped recording when Ava walked in. Ava spoke to Ryan in a tone low enough that it didn't carry to the surrounding tables, confirming what she had understood from his call, the location, the situation, the outline of what had happened. Ryan gave her the version without editorializing. He described the change dispute, the currency examination, the bag inspection, the instruction to get down and pick up the coins. He said it the way someone reads back a list of observed facts without inflection, without the particular emphasis that would have signaled how he felt about any of it. Ava listened with her hands flat on the table and her expression very still. When he finished, She asked if he wanted her to handle it. He said he would handle it himself. She nodded once and stayed where she was. Ryan stood up from the table and walked across the dining room toward the host stand. He did not walk quickly. The room tracked him the way rooms track something they have been waiting for, without knowing it, a gradual reorientation of attention conversations halting mid-sentence forks set down. Lauren watched him cross the room with the expression of someone who has run out of positions to take and is now simply waiting for what comes next. Ryan stopped in front of the host stand. He looked at Lauren directly and said her name, just her name. Nothing else to establish that he knew it, that he had read the name tag she was wearing in the restaurant he now owned. Lauren's hand tightened slightly on the edge of the counter. She said, with the last remnant of the authority she had been performing all morning, that she could explain. Ryan said he was sure she could. He said he was less interested in the explanation than in something else entirely. And Lauren stopped. He told her that what had happened this morning was not at its core a problem of mistaken identity. He said that clearly without haste. He told her that the problem was not that she had ordered the wrong person to get down on the floor. The problem was that she had decided it was acceptable to order anyone to get down on the floor, that there existed, in her understanding of how a room worked, a category of person to whom that instruction could be reasonably directed. He said that the jacket and the shoes had told her something, and she had acted on what they told her without a single moment of hesitation. And that was what he was standing here to address. Not the error, the thinking behind it. Lauren opened her mouth and closed it again. What she had prepared, the apology, the context, the explanation about stress and a difficult morning, and a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand, none of it fit the shape of what Ryan had just said. She had expected anger, or at minimum the kind of confrontation that would give her something to push back against. This was different. This required her to respond, not to what she had done, but to what she was, and she did not have a prepared answer for that. Ryan told her that she was suspended effective immediately pending a full internal review. He said it without ceremony, the way someone states a decision they made some time ago and are only now communicating. He told her that Ava Reynolds would be overseeing the review process and that Lauren would be contacted with further details. He said she should collect her personal belongings and that Douglas would escort her out. He said that last part, looking briefly in Douglas's direction, not as an instruction, so much as an acknowledgement that Douglas was present and that his role in the next few minutes was clear. Douglas uncrossed his arms. Lauren stood at the host stand for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then she reached under the counter, picked up a small tote bag, and walked toward the back of the restaurant without looking at anyone. Douglas followed at a steady distance, saying nothing. The door to the back of house swung shut behind them, and the dining room exhaled in the collective, involuntary way of a room that has been holding something for a long time and has finally been permitted to set it down. Emily was standing near the service station when Ryan turned around. She was holding a coffee pot she had stopped using some time ago, watching him with the careful attention of someone who was not sure yet which way the next thing was going to fall. Ryan walked toward her, and she straightened slightly, the automatic response of someone accustomed to being called to account for things that weren't her fault. He stopped a few feet away and told her that her section looked like it had been covering considerably more ground than it was supposed to. Emily said that things had a way of piling up sometimes. Ryan said he had noticed that, and he meant it as more than a comment about the morning. He thanked her for the refill. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that suggested she was recalibrating something, and then she nodded and said it wasn't a problem. It was a small exchange, and it was over quickly, but Emily's shoulders dropped about half an inch as Ryan walked away, and the tightness around her eyes, which had been there since at least 11 in the morning, eased into something closer to ordinary. Ava had moved from the table by then and was standing near the center of the dining room with her phone in her hand, already working. She looked up when Ryan approached and told him that she had 3 other location managers who needed to be briefed before end of day, that the review process would take approximately 2 weeks to complete, given the documentation required, and that she had already sent a preliminary note to the HR coordinator. Ryan said that was fine. He said he also wanted a full record of any guest complaints filed against Willow Terrace in the previous 18 months, not just the ones that had made it into the formal system, but any informal records, any notes, anything that had been logged, and then quietly set aside. Ava wrote that down. She knew what he was implying, and she did not need it spelled out. What followed over the next several weeks was not dramatic. It was methodical, which is generally how real change moves when it intends to hold. The internal review opened formally 3 days after the incident and turned up more than Lauren's individual conduct. 2 other staff members had witnessed previous incidents and said nothing in one case because they had been explicitly told that complaints against management went nowhere, and in another, because a prior complaint had been redirected back to the very manager it concerned. A guest who had filed a written complaint 4 months earlier received a call informing her that her complaint had finally been reviewed. She had never been contacted at the time it was submitted. The complaint had been filed in a folder that had no formal place in any process Ryan could identify in a drawer that appeared to have functioned for some time, as a place where inconvenient documentation went to stop being inconvenient. The review also surfaced the managers at 2 other locations who had received similar informal reports from their own staff that had never been escalated. Ryan went through each of those, personally reading the summaries Ava compiled, without delegating the reading to anyone else. He wanted to understand not just the incidents, but the architecture, the way a culture that permitted this kind of behavior had organized itself to stay invisible. It had done so through a series of small accommodations that individually looked like nothing: a turned eye here, a downgraded complaint there, a general institutional preference for stability over accountability that had calcified over years into something that looked from a distance like a professionally run operation. Up close, it looked like what it was. He rebuilt the intake process for guest concerns from scratch, establishing a direct reporting line that bypassed local management entirely and fed into a centralized review team that Ava's office oversaw. He introduced unannounced visits as a formal operational practice, not a secret, not something staff were supposed to be unaware of, but a documented and regular part of how the chain monitored its own standards. The point was not to catch people in failures. The point was to make it normal for every room to be treated as though someone was paying attention, because someone always would be. Emily was reassigned to a senior floor position at Willow Terrace with the accompanying pay adjustment. The recommendation came from Ava, who had spoken with 3 other staff members after the incident and heard the same description of Emily's conduct. From all of them, that she had consistently done more than her role required, covered for deficiencies she had no obligation to cover for, and treated every guest with the same quality of attention, regardless of what they were spending or how they were dressed. Ryan approved the recommendation without modification. He thought the promotion was, if anything, slightly delayed. The anti-discrimination training that rolled out across the 7 locations was not the kind that involved a video and a checkbox on an HR form. Ryan had seen enough of those to know what they produced, which was documentation, and not much else. What he implemented instead was a structured program developed with direct input from the floor staff at each location, the people who actually ran the rooms and understood where the pressure points were, and what kinds of judgment calls managers made daily that determined whether a room felt welcoming or merely functional. It took longer to build. It was less tidy to administer. He did it anyway, because the easier version had already proven across several locations in several years that it did not work. 3 weeks after the incident at Willow Terrace, Ryan drove back to the same location on a Tuesday morning at approximately the same time he had arrived on the day everything had happened. He wore the same jacket, the same jeans, the shoes he still had not replaced. He parked in the same spot and sat in the car for a moment before going in, not from hesitation, but from the habit of composing himself before a visit, of setting aside what he expected to find so that he could see what was actually there. He walked through the front door. The man at the host stand someone Ryan had not seen before. A new hire, whose name tag read Marcus, looked up when Ryan entered and said good morning with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who had been trained to mean it and had decided to. He asked if Ryan had a preference for seating. Ryan said the bar was fine if there was space. Marcus checked and said there was, and walked him to a stool at the end of the bar near the window without the performance of assessment that had preceded every interaction on his first visit. It was a small thing. It was the entire thing. The coffee arrived promptly. It was the same quality as before, good better than it needed to be. A point in the kitchen's favor that had always been true and had nothing to do with Lauren Mitchell or anyone she had hired. The croissant was warm. Emily appeared from the far side of the dining room, recognized Ryan, and crossed to where he was sitting. She said good morning. He said good morning. She asked how the coffee was. He said it was good. She said she would let them know. It was a completely ordinary exchange between a guest and a server, which was the entire point, and both of them understood that without saying it. Ryan sat at the bar for about 40 minutes. He watched the room the way he always watched rooms, without a notepad, without anything that would have told a passing observer what he was actually doing. What he saw was a room that was working. Staff moved with purpose and without the visible tension that had characterized the floor on his first visit. Tables were turned at a reasonable pace. A guest near the entrance flagged down a passing server and received immediate attention. The water glasses stayed full. The room felt for the first time since he had walked into it like a place that was trying to be what it was supposed to be. Before he left, Ryan walked toward the door and stopped near the entrance where a small framed card had been mounted on the wall at eye level. It was new. He had approved the installation himself, but he had not chosen the wording. That had come from a suggestion submitted anonymously through the staff feedback channel he had opened as part of the operational rebuild. Someone who worked in this building every day had written it and sent it in without putting their name on it, which told him something about the kind of people who had been here all along, doing their jobs well in a room that had not yet deserved them. He read it the way he always read things he already knew, slowly to make sure the meaning still held. Character is revealed by how you treat people who can do nothing for you. Ryan stood in front of it for a moment. Then he put on his jacket, picked up his bag, and walked out into the morning. The door swung shut behind him. Inside the room kept going the way a room keeps going when the people in it have finally been given the conditions to do their jobs with some dignity and have decided without being told that this is worth taking care of.